Marcus Ellington woke up at 4:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before his alarm. He lay in the dark for a moment, staring at the ceiling of his Atlanta penthouse, listening to the city below him doing what cities do before sunrise: garbage trucks, a distant siren, the low hum of a world that never fully sleeps. He had a board presentation in New York at 2 in the afternoon. He had 47 slides, 3 years of revenue data, and a logistics network that moved goods across 11 states. He also had a private jet waiting for him at Hartsfield-Jackson, because when you build something from nothing, you eventually stop asking other people's permission to board their planes. He got up, made coffee, stood at the floor-to-ceiling window in his kitchen and looked at Atlanta like a man who still remembered what it looked like from much further below. He had grown up 20 minutes south of this view, in a neighborhood where the streetlights went out and stayed out and nobody sent anyone to fix them. His mother had worked 2 jobs. His father had worked 3 and still come home tired in a way that had nothing to do with the body. Marcus had watched all of it and decided, at an age when most children are deciding what cartoon to watch, that he would not live the way they lived. Not because he was ashamed of them. Because he loved them too much to waste what they had given him. He was dressed and in the car by 6. The Gulfstream G550 sat on the tarmac looking exactly like what it was: expensive, elegant, and entirely his. He had bought it 3 years ago, paid in full, signed the registration himself, shaken hands with the seller in a room where he was the youngest person and the only black man, and neither of those things had bothered him even slightly. He kept the registration documents in his portfolio. Not because he was legally required to carry them. Because he had learned, early and at real cost, that the world sometimes asked for proof of things it would never ask a different kind of man to prove. His regular crew was on scheduled leave. He had arranged a replacement team through an aviation staffing agency, a firm his operations director Dara had vetted and approved. 3 flight attendants. A co-pilot. A captain. Professional credentials, clean records, good reviews. Everything on paper was fine. Paper, Marcus had learned, only tells you so much. He walked across the tarmac with his coffee in one hand and his portfolio in the other, his footsteps steady and unhurried, because he had nowhere to be until 2 o'clock and his plane was not going anywhere without him. The door of the aircraft was open. A flight attendant stood at the entrance. Her name, as he would later find out, was Sandra. She was in her early 40s, neat uniform, hair pulled back, the professional expression of someone who had been doing this job long enough to have an expression that revealed nothing. She looked at Marcus as he approached the steps. She looked at him the way people sometimes look at something they did not expect to see in a particular place. Not with cruelty, exactly. With a kind of flat, automatic assessment that lasted only a second but said a great deal. She asked for his boarding pass. Marcus stopped at the bottom of the steps. He stood there for a moment with his coffee and his portfolio and the specific patience of a man who had been asked questions like this before and had made peace with the fact that he would be asked them again. He told her, in a calm and even voice, that it was his aircraft. Sandra smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that lives entirely on the surface of the face without reaching anything underneath. She said she understood, and she apologized for the confusion, and she asked if he could perhaps provide some documentation or wait while she confirmed his identity with the ground crew, because those were simply the procedures. The procedures. Marcus looked at her for a moment. He did not raise his voice. He had never found much use in raised voices. What raising your voice tells the other person is that you have run out of better tools, and Marcus had not run out of better tools. He opened his portfolio, retrieved the aircraft registration documents, the ones with his full legal name, the tail number of the aircraft, the date of purchase, the signature of the seller, and held them out. Sandra took them. She studied them with the careful attention of someone looking for a problem. She found no problem, because there was no problem to find. She handed them back and said she would still need to make a brief call to the agency to confirm. Something crossed Marcus's face then. It was not anger. It was something quieter than anger and considerably more difficult to look at. It was the expression of a man who had built something remarkable and was standing at the door of it being asked to prove he belonged there, and who had been asked the same question, in various forms, for his entire adult life. He said, very quietly, "I'll be inside." He stepped onto his own plane, walked to his seat, opened his laptop, and went back to his board presentation. Sandra made her call. Whatever was said on the other end, the flight eventually departed on schedule. The crew performed their duties. The coffee was hot. The turbulence over the Carolinas was mild. Nobody said anything to Marcus that was not strictly professional, which was itself a kind of silence that had weight and texture and meaning. Marcus reviewed his slides. He adjusted 3 charts. He rewrote the opening paragraph of his remarks because it was good but not quite right, and he had always believed that good was the enemy of right. Somewhere over Virginia, he picked up his phone. He called Dara. Dara Osei had been his chief of operations for 6 years. She had started as his second employee, when the company was one leased warehouse and a pickup truck and a vision that most people in Marcus's life had privately believed was too large for the reality of his circumstances. She had believed it from the first week. She still did. She was also one of the most efficient people Marcus had ever met, which was why he had called her and not his assistant. He told her what had happened. He spoke the way he always spoke, clearly, without drama, in complete sentences. He told her the name of the agency. The time of the incident. The name on the crew manifest. The tail number, though she already knew it. Then he said, "Pull the contract." There was a brief pause. Dara said, "Marcus, that's our largest charter agency relationship. If we pull it." "I know what it is," he said. "Pull it." She said, "Okay." She pulled it. The termination notice reached the agency's operations director at 9:22 in the morning, while the plane was somewhere over Delaware. The Ellington Logistics Group account had represented, in the most recent fiscal year, a number large enough that its disappearance would require an uncomfortable conversation with several senior people at the agency. The notice did not explain the reason for termination. It did not need to explain anything. That was the nature of contract arrangements. They existed at the pleasure of both parties, and the pleasure of one party had expired. The operations director called Dara. Dara did not take the call. The plane landed at Teterboro Airport at 11:51 in the morning. Marcus walked off it the same way he had walked on, unhurried, portfolio in hand, coffee now cold and mostly forgotten. A car was waiting. He had 2 hours before the presentation. He used one of them to sit in a quiet corner of a coffee shop near the meeting venue and read through his slides one final time, making 2 more small adjustments, because that was the kind of man he was, the kind who kept going until the thing was right. The presentation went well. It went, in fact, better than well. The board asked sharp questions and Marcus answered them with the ease of someone who had been living inside these numbers for 3 years and knew them the way other people know their own addresses. By the time he left the room, 3 of the 7 board members had come to shake his hand individually, which was not a thing they always did. He flew home that evening on a commercial flight, because his regular crew was not available until the following morning and he did not want to put Dara through another agency arrangement. The seat was narrow. The man beside him fell asleep on his shoulder somewhere over Tennessee. Marcus moved carefully so as not to wake him and spent the rest of the flight looking out the window at the dark country below. He was not thinking about Sandra. He was thinking about his next quarter's targets. The story reached the internet 3 days later. It came through someone who worked at the staffing agency, a junior coordinator who had been in the operations room when the termination notice arrived and who had, in the days that followed, watched the fallout move through the company like weather. She was not a whistleblower by nature. She was simply someone who had a conscience and a phone and a growing sense that what had happened was something people should know about. She posted the account on a professional networking site. She used no names, but she described the incident with enough detail: the Atlanta departure, the private Gulfstream, the CEO turned away at the door of his own aircraft, that the identity of the company became clear within the first hour to anyone who wanted to look. By the second hour, the post had been shared 800 times. By the end of the first day, it had reached people who had no connection to aviation, logistics, or Atlanta, who shared it simply because it told a story they recognized. Not everyone had built a logistics empire. But a great many people knew what it felt like to stand somewhere you had every right to stand and be asked to prove it. The responses divided, as responses always do, into camps. There were those who said Marcus had acted with grace and precision and exactly the kind of measured, consequential response that the situation deserved. There were others who said he had punished an entire crew for one person's behavior, which was too severe. There were others still who argued at length about whether Sandra had simply been following procedure, as though the question of which procedure gets applied to which person, and why, was not itself the entire point. Marcus did not respond to any of it. He did, after some consideration, allow his communications team to release a single statement. It read: "We hold all contractors to the same standard we hold ourselves. Professionalism is not conditional. 12 words. No mention of race. No mention of Sandra. No self-pity, no theater, no invitation to sympathy." It was, several journalists noted, exactly the kind of statement you would write if you were very confident and had nothing left to prove. Sandra, for her part, was not publicly identified by name at any point during the initial wave of coverage. She gave no interviews. Whether she understood what she had done as a mistake, or as the correct application of a procedure that happened to land badly, or as something she could not quite bring herself to examine too closely, none of that was known. People speculated, as people do. The speculation was not always kind. Marcus, when asked in a later interview whether he bore her any personal ill will, paused for a moment and then said he did not spend much time thinking about it. He said it in the tone of a man who meant it. What people kept returning to, in the weeks after the story faded from the front page of the internet and settled into the longer memory of the culture, was a detail that seemed small and was not small at all. He had been carrying the registration documents. Not because any law required it. Not because his lawyers had told him to. Because he was a black man in America who owned an expensive thing, and he had understood, long before that morning on the tarmac, that owning something and being recognized as owning it were not always the same experience. He had prepared for the question before it was asked. He had carried the answer in his portfolio next to his board presentation, tucked behind the revenue charts and the market projections, ready. That detail, the documents in the portfolio, the habit of carrying proof, said something that the rest of the story could not quite say in plain language. It said that success, for some people, does not arrive as freedom from a particular kind of scrutiny. It arrives alongside it. You build the empire and you carry the paperwork. You own the plane and you bring the registration. You earn the seat at the table and you show up early enough to prove you were invited. Marcus Ellington understood this not as injustice, though it was that, but as a condition of the world as it currently existed. He was not naive about the world. He had never had the luxury of naivety. What he had instead was a very clear understanding of the difference between things he could change with energy and things he could change with excellence, and he had spent 20 years applying his energy almost entirely to the second category. The board presentation in New York became the basis of a new 5-year expansion plan for Ellington Logistics Group. 2 new distribution centers. 4 new states. A projected revenue increase of 31% over 30 months. His regular crew returned from leave the following week. Marcus walked onto the plane and the lead attendant, a woman named Patricia who had been flying with him for 4 years, handed him his coffee exactly the way he liked it, black, no sugar, hot enough to need a moment before drinking. She did not ask him for his boarding pass. She never had. He sat down, opened his laptop, and started working on the next quarter. Outside, Atlanta was doing what Atlanta always does, growing, pushing, building itself upward and outward in every direction, always becoming something larger than it was the day before. Marcus Ellington had learned that from it. Or perhaps it had learned that from him. Either way, they had both, in their own ways, decided a long time ago that they were not going anywhere.